All right, guys. So welcome to server-side tagging in Google Tag Manager, a free webinar around the subject. Google released last week server-side tagging into public beta, and this webinar is all about that. I'm going to go over the agenda very shortly, but before I do, I want to go over just some ways to make this webinar flow as smoothly as possible. So you've already found the chat window, and I'm just going to remind you once more that if you want other people to see your chat messages, make sure you select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu, so that other people can see your messages as well. If it's just all panelists, which is the default, I'm the only one who's going to see those. You can use the chat as much as you like, and I encourage you to do that just to kind of unravel what we've been talking about in this webinar. I probably won't have time to go over the chat in this during this webinar because it's so time consuming to just sift through those messages, and it's just me here behind the camera. I don't have a moderator, I don't have a pair of helping hands, so I'm not going to be using the chat. Instead, if you have any questions you want to ask, the Q&A feature in Zoom is what you'll see when you hover over the menu bar in Zoom. You can ask questions there, and please do ask any questions at any time. And then there's the upvote feature, so use that as well so that I can prioritize those questions and make sure that the ones that people want to be answered first will get answered first. If all goes well, I'm going to be able to go through all the questions that you throw my way. If the previous two webinars have been any indication, the first one to the Australia and Oceania time zones took about 1.5 hours, but we only had a bit over 100 attendees and maybe 30, 40 questions. The second one for Europe took almost 2.5 hours, and we had over 100 questions. And this one, I think, is going to fall into between those. So I anticipate something like, 1.5 hours, maybe 2 hours tops, depending on how many questions you have coming my way. But I promise to do my best to keep my voice intact and make it to the end so that we can tackle those questions, because those questions are definitely the best part of this presentation. And this is not self-deprecating intentionally. I think the content itself is going to be good, but the questions are where the insights come up. So use the Q&A feature at any time. Ask whatever questions you find are important. But one tip is to go, before you ask a question, go through the list of questions that have already been asked and check if your question is already there, and then just upvote that one instead of adding the question multiple times. Because like I said, I don't have a moderator who's going to go through those, so I'll be reading the same question many times over and over. So it's just going to be easier if you kind of consolidate those. What else? There will be a recording of this webinar in my YouTube channel. I'll share the link in Twitter and LinkedIn. Once the videos are up, it's going to take a couple of days for me to go through all this stuff. I haven't yet decided how I'm going to publish those videos, just as is, or will I do some editing? At least I'll do some annotations so you'll know where the questions begin and so on. Was there anything else I should mention? Maybe not. So let's just get going and see how everything goes, and just use the Q&A tool, please, because that's how we'll be able to communicate. I'll check chat every now and then. I'm going to tackle the Q&A at the very end, so there's going to be almost certainly many questions asked in the beginning of the presentation that I'll end up answering during the presentation, and that's fine. And I hope you'll just bear with me as we go over these little technical snafus that we're definitely going to be having. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And if somebody can just do a virtual thumbs up to let me know that they can see the shared screen. All right, well, great, thanks. I should never say, could someone please do something, because then there's going to be 100 people doing it. Great, thanks. So we're ready to go. So once again, welcome to, let's see if I know how to, oh, here we go. Welcome to server-side tagging in Google Tag Manager, a live webinar on today, 20th of August, 2020. Um, Today, we're going to go over a couple of things, but before we go to the agenda, I want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Jeff Sauer, who's my gold, platinum, diamond level sponsor in this webinar. Also my only sponsor, so he has all those levels for himself. Jeff is a wonderful, wonderful human being and a super talented and prolific Google Analytics and the Google marketing stack and digital marketing educator in general. So take a look at Data Driven. It's datadrivenu.com. They have lots of courses around Google, Google Analytics, Google Ads, Facebook Ads, how to build your own digital agency, how to start as a course instructor, and so on. Lots of great content. And Jeff has been very, very kind in helping me, how to run a webinar in the first place. And I also want to mention my own blog, simply because right now there's the 4 most recent articles all cover the server-side tagging topic. So most of the stuff that I'm going to be presenting today has already been in the blog in one format or another. So I want to, if you take your time to take a look at that content, there's probably going to be a lot of questions answered that you might not get answered during this short presentation. And there's my Twitter handle as well. I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn, so if you want information like the latest news or latest releases, you can just follow me. And I'll be sharing those YouTube links to Twitter and LinkedIn, so that's another reason if you want to follow me just for the period of time, so you'll get those links, and then I'm okay with you unfollowing me after that. Server-side tagging. So this is amazing animations that I've learned to do over the last couple of days. Cool stuff that you could do with presentations. We're going to start with an introduction to server-side tagging, a very superficial introduction. I have a expectation that people attending this webinar know the basics of Google Tag Manager, so I'm not going to start going over what is a container, what is a tag, what is a trigger. I just want to jump into the deep end immediately and explain what server-side tagging is. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about key benefits and concerns, because that's one of the ways that you'll be able to kind of pitch this idea in your organizations, or even to yourself if you're a skeptic about what server-side tagging is, and especially what it isn't. And this is all very opinionated, of course, and also very biased. I've had a lot of time to play with server-side tagging because I was in the a beta tester. I've formulated a lot of very strong opinions about it, and they might not be mainstream. So please, again, don't take anything I say as gospel. Make up your own mind. I hope that I've given, after this webinar, you'll have more than enough resources to kind of develop your own approach to server-side tagging. But I'm definitely going to be tackling some of those hot topics around server-side because I know that they are top of mind for so many people. Then we're going to go into a walkthrough where I'll do the scariest thing possible, which is like live coding. And we're going to take a typical Google Analytics web GTM setup and convert that to be compatible with server-side. So you'll be able to see how you would approach the problem of migration from client-side to server-side. And then finally, whatever time we have left, we'll spend with Q&A. Like I said, there's no specific deadline here. I'm good to go for as long as my voice is okay and there are still questions to be answered. So just keep those questions coming and we'll tackle them. And keep the chat active as well. Feel free to start discussions there as well. So server-side tagging represents a server endpoint. And I think at this point, a specific terminology is important to go over. So with server-side, we are talking something that's on the opposite end of the spectrum from client-side. Client-side is typically a browser, a device, some end user facing or a user facing portal that communicates with a server. Typically, you would have browsers and devices as examples, but a client could also be smart refrigerator or even a command line that sends HTTP requests to a server. Whereas a server is an endpoint that actually digests those requests and does something with them. So when we're talking about server-side tagging, we're talking about an endpoint in a server environment to which you send data to. The key thing about Google server-side tagging is that you own this endpoint. It's completely in your ownership. And you have full control over it. You have the full power of the Google Cloud Platform in its current deployment to work with that data. So I like this metaphor that one of the engineers working on server-side GTM used. It's a staging area. So instead of the browser or the device sending data directly to vendors and vendors adding their JavaScript directly to pages and sites, you'll be able to use the server-side endpoint as a proxy. So instead of sending the data to vendors, you're sending it to the server-side endpoint. And it's a staging area where you can kind of manipulate that data and validate that data and look for things like constant strings, PII, and remove that stuff or you know, acknowledge the consent and then block the tag from firing if there is no consent. You know, remove harmful cookie headers. Make sure that the vendor in the end only receives information that you have explicitly allowed them to receive, rather than add their own third-party JavaScript on the site and then have like a free-for-all, be able to use whatever data they want. So it gives you this kind of a controlled environment where you can, it's like a protective bubble for the data leaving the website or leaving the device, where you can, as the site owner, you can analyze that data before it actually ships to the vendors. So this is when I say right here, it gives you unprecedented control. I'm not talking about GTM inventing the wheel here. Like server-side tagging, server-side solutions have existed for a long time. There's Signal, there's some Segment, you know, Telium. GTM is actually pretty late to the game, but it is unprecedented in the Google stack, because until this moment, if you're working with Google tools, you're almost always working directly from the browser. So you're sending conversions to a Google Ads endpoint. You're sending analytics hits to a Google Analytics or Atlas Web endpoint. You're sending floodlight counter hits to a DoubleClick endpoint and so on. So the browser is communicating directly with Google endpoints, which carries the potential risks of communicating directly with third-party vendors, which include things like cookie leaks, PII leaks in referrers, CSP problems, hijacked scripts, malware, all this baggage that comes with having third-party scripts running in your browser. So now we're shifting that dynamic away from the browser to the server-side endpoint, which you own, and this gives you this kind of unprecedented control over the Google stack. Here are some of the benefits, which we'll all cover a bit later, but you know, you can reduce client-side load. You're no longer downloading those expensive third-party libraries, but you're just shipping that information in a vendor-agnostic data stream, for example, into the server endpoint. The server endpoint kind of digests it and does stuff with it, and the server then sends the information to the vendors. So you're keeping the client clean of all this third-party JavaScript. It lets you avoid things that come with third-party JavaScript, which include things like PII and cookie leaks. So for example, if the current page URL has some sensitive information, it's sent as an HTTP header to all those third-party vendors, which makes you liable in many ways for leaking that information. But now that you're sending them to your server endpoint that you own, even if there is a leak, it's still controlled by your organization, and you can mitigate it before you send that data to the vendors. By not allowing third-party cookies anymore, you're combating cross-site tracking. You can also move first-party cookies to become HTTP-only cookies, which also helps with cross-site tracking. And then there's the full scale and power of the cloud ecosystem, where you can do things like call expensive APIs, like do cryptographic hashing, or geolocation, and all these different things that take a lot of browser resources, but instead of running them in the browser, you're now running them in the server endpoint. So it gives you a lot of power there as well. And finally, this applies to GTM in general and all kind of tagging solutions in general. I have a lot of opinions on how to use server-side GTM, but that's just one way to use it. It's a complete blank slate. It can be used for really constructive stuff, things that improve your data validation, your data security, your data privacy. It can be a huge benefit to an organization that wants to take consent seriously and wants to avoid data breaches and credential leaks and things like that. But it can also be used by organizations for destructive purposes, for circumventing ad blockers, for moving data collection to an opaque server environment where you can do whatever you want with it, and the user will never know because they don't have visibility to it. So it's a total blank slate. It's just as good or evil as the people operating it. It's just a technology. It's just a tool. It's not a magic bullet that fixes ad tech. It's not a magic bullet that fixes legislation or anything like that. Server-side tagging manifests as a new container type. So when you go into GTM to create a new container, you can see the new server option at the bottom there. And this is in both free and 360. You'll also see the beta label there, and that's an important aspect of server-side tagging. It's in public beta, which typically in Google parlance means that it's feature ready, but it's not yet feature complete. So it's production ready as well. I've already installed it on numerous production environments. That's because I trust that it's able to execute on them. But it is beta. There's no SLA yet in place. There's going to be lots of features coming in before it's released to the public. So before it's released out of beta. And we don't know yet what the dynamic between free and 360 will be. Will there be enterprise features only, or will it all be part of the free offering? Once you've created the container, you have the option of how to deploy it. And currently the only deployment option is Google Cloud. But that doesn't mean there aren't going to be other options. So if you don't want to use Google Cloud, or if you think it's cost prohibitive, you can wait for a little while. There's probably going to be quite soon, hopefully, an AWS option if you want to prefer Amazon instead, and hopefully we'll see an on-premises option as well. The thing about server-side tagging is that it's basically a Dockerized container. It's a portable piece of technology that technically could be run anywhere where you can run containers, any type of Kubernetes setup or a container engine. But there are some things that only work with App Engine currently, such as preview mode. So it's not that's part of the feature set that's still being developed. So you might still want to wait for official support for multi-cloud before trying to port this to Amazon, for example. So currently it works in Google Cloud, and when you choose the automatic provisioning, it creates a single App Engine standard instance. App Engine is a managed virtual machine environment in Google Cloud. It's very, very simple to use. And with GTM, server-side GTM, you don't actually have to touch App Engine itself at all. You don't have to even visit the Google Cloud Console at all. All you have to do is click the automatically provisioning. It will run the scripts, and then you will have to add your credit card to your Google Cloud account, basically, and that's it. The single standard instance that the automatic provisioning does will not take you far. It's super slow. It's very ineffective. It's a way for you to kick the tires before jumping in. So it's almost certainly going to be totally free as well. So no cost will be incurred. Especially if you're a new Google Cloud user, you have 300 USD of credit before you have to pay for anything anyway. So that's going to take you a long way with just the automatically provisioned server. Once you're ready to move to a production environment, you need to provision some extra servers. And at this point, you do need to visit Google Cloud. You need to run a shell script, which is documented really, really well. Google's documentation for server-side tagging is stellar. I'm really proud of them in this case. They've done a great job with the documentation. So the user guide has the steps you need to take to manually create those extra servers that you need. For a production-ready deployment, the recommended server setup is 3 App Engine flexible instances, with a maximum of auto scaling up to 6. And that should take care of almost any website on the world with 6 App Engine instances a maximum. And I'm going to get back to how much this whole thing will cost in just a bit. Another thing you can do, and you should do very soon, is map your own custom domain to your server-side endpoint. If you don't do this, it's going to respond with the Google App Engine domain appspot.com. Which is problematic because it's a Google-owned domain and Google-owned DNS, so your traffic will be going through Google's name servers and Google's DNS. Whereas if you use your own name servers, the traffic will be going through your own domain name, and the other benefit is that it's going to be first party to your main website. So sgtm.simoahava.com is what you see here. That's what I've mapped my server-side endpoint to. So now when my website at simoahava.com communicates with this with this server-side endpoint, it's going to be in first-party context. So it's going to be first-party cookies, and I can do a lot of stuff to avoid the problems that come with third-party cookies and third-party context for HTTP requests, especially in today's browsers tracking prevention world. So mapping your own custom domain is a good first step. You can map multiple domains. If you have multiple different sites that all need to use the server-side endpoint, you can actually map multiple custom domains to a single App Engine project. However, currently GTM's preview mode only works with a single domain. So again, it's part of the feature set that they're hopefully going to fix to have proper multi-domain support or multi-site support. So here's an example of the cost. This is running 3 App Engine standard instances. So the minimum recommended production setup on a website, which generates some thousands of hits per day, maybe 10,000 hits a day. So as you can see, it's practically flatlining. This means that this particular website is never pushing the boundaries. The 3 instances are completely adequate for this setup. And with 3 instances, the cost is around 100 euros a month. So it's roughly $40 US per instance per month. So if you're using 3 instances, it's 120 USD a month. And that's the minimum you'll be paying for a production ready environment if you follow the recommended specs. Once you start getting more traffic, so more network egress, so maybe we're talking about like a million hits a day, 10 million hits a day, 100 million hits a day, you're going to be taking up more instance hours in App Engine, which means that you'll be facing a bit more charges. I have a site where this is running, which collects something like 10 million hits a day. And for them, it's around 3 times as much the cost here. So around 300 euros a month. It's not just about the quantity of the hits, but also what those payloads are comprised of. So, or what those payloads comprise. So if they're like huge, complex payloads, it's of course going to create more network traffic. And then it of course depends on what you do in the server-side container. If you run really complex and like performance-heavy API calls, multi-threaded things, you'll be facing more costs. So it's also an optimization question. How do you make your setup leaner? But as you can see, there is a cost involved. It's not free in the terms of how web GTM is free, but it's also not prohibitively expensive to organizations that are able to make this investment. For smaller companies, yes, it's going to be a problem to justify this extra cost. But I hope that what I'm presenting today will help you make your mind whether or not this is a worthy investment to make. The following 2 slides are borrowed from Google's documentation, and this is just to show how the dynamic has shifted from traditional web GTM to server-side. So traditionally, you have the situation where your tag manager web container is running on a website, and you have tags for Google Analytics, you have tags for Google Ads, and you have tags for, let's say, Facebook. And each of these tags is represented by its own JavaScript snippet or JavaScript library running in GTM. And each of these tags is communicating with its own corresponding third-party endpoint. So Google Analytics tag will send data to Google Analytics. Google Ads tag will send data to Google Ads, and so on. So you have all these multiple different streams, even though much of the information that's sent in these streams is actually overlapping. There's a lot of commonalities between what you send to GA and what you send to Facebook. The semantics are very similar. The keys and the parameter names are just different. So the way that server-side tagging kind of tackles this problem is it introduces this new thing called a client. And the client takes in those HTTP requests. So instead of sending the Google Analytics hit to the vendor, you send it to the server-side endpoint, where a client takes that measurement protocol request, kind of chumps it up, spits out an event object. It's an event model, which I'll show you soon. And then that event model can be used to fire tags. But the cool thing about server-side is that the single client and that single web stream, let's say it's a universal analytics stream, a universal analytics measurement protocol request, that client can take that measurement protocol request, create that event and fire those tags, but it can fire a Facebook tag, it can fire a Apple's web tag, it can fire a Google Ads tag, all with the same measurement protocol request, because all of these endpoints can map that information in the measurement protocol and use that. So you're basically consolidating 3 different data streams to a single stream in this perfect example. It's of course very difficult to do consistently and requires cooperation, not just between you and your IT maybe, but also, you know, the vendors have to play this game out as well. They have to reshape their endpoints to be more conforming to these kind of generic schemas. But I'll show you an example of this soon. This is all just theory. I know that it might be very complicated to follow, but as soon as I'll be able to go to the walkthrough, it's gonna elucidate a lot of this. Server-side tagging looks, sounds, feels, and smells exactly like GTM that you know. The only difference in the overview screen is that new clients thing, and there's no zones if you're in 360. Preview mode has changed as well. It opens a new tab, and in preview mode, you now, instead of data layer events, you have HTTP requests. So everything under summary represents an incoming HTTP request to the server endpoint. And these 2 examples are incoming measurement protocol requests. So the Google Universal Analytics tag firing on the website, instead of sending the data to Google Analytics, is sending it to my server-side endpoint, and it shows up in preview mode like this. The page view and timing complete represent the event model that the Universal Analytics client kind of parsed from the measurement protocol request. And then this event model then fires the Universal Analytics tag, which then sends an outgoing HTTP request to Google Analytics servers. And I'll show you how this all works in a bit. So this gives us lots of opportunities to improve data quality. You can do things like set a cookie in the response back from the server-side endpoint. So you can rewrite the GA cookie in a set cookie header, for example, which makes it work nicely with Safari's intelligent tracking prevention, for example, because ITP currently reduces all client-side cookies, all JavaScript set cookies to a maximum 7 days expiration. Whereas if you set them in a set cookie header like this, they're going to expire whenever the cookie is meant to expire. So in 2 years' time, if it's GA in question. So this is just an example of what you can do. So that was the brief introduction. I'm just going to jump right to benefits and concerns. And we'll start with 2 of the most important benefits of server-side tagging. The first one is that you own the data. You own everything that happens within the server-side environment. But you have to take Google's word for this. If you're a Google skeptic, as of course you have the full right to be, and I'm not surprised if many of you are, you'll be taking a lot of this with a grain of salt. When Google says that you own your data, it's going to raise questions. But in this case, this is the cloud platform, and there's no. I'm going to be naive and say that there's no reason for them to lie about this. It's a cloud platform. It's not a data collection machine in itself. It's infrastructure for rent. So you own that data that is worked up in that infrastructure, and you have full control over it. If you're a skeptic and if you don't believe this, that's fine. Then you can just sit around and wait for a while for other solutions to come up, like the AWS or on-premises. And then you can choose the one that you trust the most or the one that has the best costs. But personally, I'm a long-time Google Cloud user, and I'm very happy that that this is running on Google Cloud, because it does give me the type of ownership that I want, rather than this being on a Google Analytics server under a Google Analytics privacy policy or terms of service. Now you're using the cloud environment, which is a completely different thing. And this is the other big benefit. You'll be able to, in the perfect scenario, you'll be able to get rid of a lot of third-party JavaScript running in the browser, because you'll be able to create your own little JavaScript snippets, your own libraries, or you'll be able to piggyback off existing libraries like Atlas Web or Google Analytics to fan those hits out into your vendor endpoints. So you can send your Facebook events without even having a Facebook tag firing on the website. You can leverage Atlas Web, you can leverage Universal Analytics. It's not entirely out of the box. It will require some tweaks, but it's still doable. So the more you can get rid of that third-party JavaScript, the better. Because the other benefit comes not just from reducing load, because communicating with those CDNs is super expensive performance-wise, and it's the first thing that all these page speed insights and Lighthouse and all these page speed evaluation tools complain about. And the other thing is your content security policies. So anytime the web browser or the website wants to communicate with a cross-site origin, such as a third-party vendor, if your site is using a content security policy, those domains need to be added to the allow list. And the longer and the larger the content security policy is, the more fragile and unreliable it becomes. Because every single time you open a door for a vendor, you open your site up for a potential attack vector if that vendor has become compromised, for example. So by removing those third-party domains from your site's render path, you'll be able to remove them from the CSP as well. And your IT governance will love you for it, because you'll be able to make that CSP a lot slimmer, and you'll be able to mitigate against those types of attack vectors that are so often manipulated. This is a really cool thing you can do with server-side tagging. A couple of years ago, Google Analytics had the big referral spam problem, or measurement protocol spam problem, where attackers were just sending measurement protocol hits to random universal analytics property IDs using some kind of a script that just scrolls through UA numbers and just sends measurement protocol hits to them. If this solution had existed back then, it would have been a great way to mitigate against that. Because what you can do is you can actually assign within the server container, within a client or a tag, you can add a custom dimension that's only available in the server container, that's hard-coded right there, so nobody in the browser can ever see it. And then you can create a filter in Google Analytics that only includes hits with that secret key. So this way the browser will never be privy to what the secret key is, and those measurement protocol spammers will not be able to know that either. Obviously, it won't prevent targeted spam. If somebody visits your site, takes a look at the request to your server-side endpoint, they can just spam that endpoint. But then you can add some controls to that endpoint, like checking if the transaction value is 1,000 times more than expected, then it's probably either a bug or somebody's intentionally sending you bogus transactions trying to skew your data. You can validate those hits in the server-side endpoint and make sure that only good-looking hits, no, that's a bad word when you're talking about data, only authentic-looking hits pass validation and enter Google Analytics servers. You can also process things like API keys, hidden credentials, hashes, all these kinds of things that you don't want to expose to the browser. So you can create complicated authentication flows against your APIs, knowing that those keys will never leak to the browser. That's a pretty cool use case for server-side tagging. You can do things like proxy JavaScript libraries. So currently there are 2 built-in APIs or 2 libraries that can be proxied automatically. So analytics.js for universal analytics and gtag.js for the global site tag. Those can both be proxied with the server-side endpoint. So instead of downloading the library from Google servers, the library can be downloaded from your server-side endpoint. This again helps you relax that content security policy. It helps you make that content security policy a bit stricter. And you can also do things like sub-resource integrity checks. You can make sure that the library downloaded from Google CDN hasn't been compromised. And you can do this for other libraries as well. There is no official support for proxying GTM yet, so the web container, but if I understood it from the documentation, it's on its way. So at some point, you'll be able to load your web Google Tag Manager container through your server-side endpoint as well. You'll also be able to write these cookies like I already showed you an example of. This is an example where the Google optimized cookie, the GAEXP cookie, is rewritten. Because right now on Safari and on iOS browsers, and any optimized experiment only creates a cookie that lasts for 7 days. So if the user visits the site after 7 days of inactivity, they'll be probably potentially assigned to a new variant mid-experiment. But rewriting the cookie as a set cookie header, you'll be able to mitigate against that. Then we go to the key concerns. And this is my biggest concern about one of my biggest concerns about server-side tagging is that it lets you circumvent ad and content blockers. So because your endpoint hasn't been blocklisted by things like Disconnect Me or EasyList, requests to it are not blocked by Firefox private windows or Ghostery or uBlock Origin. And this, I think, is a huge problem, because the user's expectation is that if they have a content blocker on, or it's a reasonable expectation that tracking will be blocked. But now tracking is still going on because you have a server endpoint that kind of circumvents that. This is a big problem because those ad blockers are fairly rudimentary, because they just map against a list of domain names. I kind of expect that they're gonna mature because of this. And instead of just blocking domains, they'll have some more intelligent heuristics in place, for example, where they look for certain identifiers, certain key value pairs in those requests themselves that could indicate that it's a tracking hit. And then instead of blocking it, they would just strip those identifiers out. This has already been pioneered in some browsers, such as the Clicks browser, which no longer exists, unfortunately. But it's a pretty cool technology. So I hope that the ad and content blocker technologies advance as well to keep up with the pace, because in its current shape and size, it doesn't do server-side GTM any favors. That the number one use case that I see online for it is, yay, we can finally circumvent content blockers. I think that's a totally unethical way to approach this question. And it kind of waters down the argument that server-side tagging is good for data security and privacy. There are ways you can be proactive. You can check if the user has an ad or a content blocker. You can check if it tries to block a request to Google servers, and then you can proactively block the request to your server-side endpoint. Or you can just be more upfront about what's going on in your documentation, get clear opt-in consent, for example. Because the other problem that comes in the same realm is the fact that of opacity of data collection. So everything happens in the servers now, and this makes it very problematic to show a clear trail of the data flow so that the user could audit it by themselves. All the user sees is potentially just a single vendor agnostic stream of information going to some random server-side endpoint. They have to trust the organization, that the organization will respect their consent, will respect the laws that are governing the data subject's rights, and be sure that, for example, no errant cookies are dropped without the explicit permission from the user, depending, of course, where you're located. But in the EU, for example, this is a very important aspect. So the fact that data collection is moved to the servers complicates matters a great deal, because now also there's a whole breed of auditors and people who, for a living, are on the side of the common web user and are looking for websites that are in breach of these web users' trust. And these auditors can't really run their tools anymore, because all they see is this vendor agnostic data stream going to the server, and they have no idea what happens in the server. So this is a very interesting problem to solve. We'll see what happens in the future. But it's definitely, I know for a fact that the Google team takes these questions around consent and compliance very, very seriously. And because there is no built-in consent management, I'm fairly certain Google is working on something along these lines, maybe some kind of APIs that we can use to make consent awareness easier to build into our templates. But we'll see what happens. Currently, the only way to kind of be consent aware is to build those templates yourself, look at those cookies by yourself, and make sure that no tag fires if the adequate consent isn't there. Whoops. The cost can be a problem for many, like I already mentioned. 100 euros a month for something that you expected maybe to be free is a big deal. So like I said, the only thing I can hope personally about this cost thing is that you have enough information in hand to make, decide if this is a worthy investment. And I'll try to show you as many features as I can today and answer as many questions as I can today to help you make that decision for your organization. I do recommend that everybody gives it a try, because you can do it with the automatically provisioned server with the App Engine standard instance. It's going to be painfully slow in many cases, but at least you'll be able to see the potential. And then you can kind of create a proof of concept out of it and pitch it to your whoever's in charge of your budget, and maybe be able to upgrade to a production ready instance after that. The last problem, not the last problem, but the last problem in my list is the fact that vendors just having the capability to accept server-to-server calls is not very impressive at the moment. The big ones all do, you know, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they all have endpoints, Twitter, they all have endpoints that respond to server-to-server calls. But there's still the long tail of a gazillion different ad tech vendors who basically either require third-party cookies to work or require their own crazy complex JavaScript to run in the browser to hash something and to encrypt something. So these vendors will need to do something if they want their if they want to enable server-to-server calls. And because Google has released this service, I'm fairly confident that a lot of vendors will start making changes to their services simply because this is going to, being Google, this is going to be a very popular service. And many users will be looking for vendors to accept this kind of a server-to-server communication channel. Great, we're through the lecture part of this presentation. I can see that there's some chat and some Q&A going on, so that's great. Keep the questions coming. And now I'm just going to jump over to a walkthrough. And the walkthrough will be quite simple, at least conceptually. We have a website that's running a single app plus web base tag or a configuration tag, which fires a page view and has the enhanced measurements, so scroll tracking and stuff like that. And then we have a single universal analytics page view tag running in the browser as well. And I have up here my preview mode for App plus Web is in debug view, and then Google Analytics is also in real time, just taking in those hits as they come. So here's my hits. So what I want to do is one by one, I want to move Universal Analytics to communicate with the server-side container, and I want to move the App plus Web tag to communicate with the server-side container instead of sending that data directly from the browser to Google servers. So we'll get started. Here we have our server container. And the first thing we need to do, let's start with Universal Analytics. We need to create the client. Nothing happens in a server-side tagging container without a client. So there has to be a client that digests those incoming requests and claims those requests. So for Universal Analytics, there's a built-in client called Universal Analytics. You can build your own custom clients. For example, I've built my own version of Universal Analytics and Facebook and App plus Web. But for this example, we'll just use the built-in Universal Analytics client. So this client looks for a measurement protocol request, a measurement protocol version 1 request, which is what Universal Analytics uses. It takes that request and it spits out the event that then fires our tags. I'm just going to switch that off for now. I'll get back to what that means in a bit. Let's rename this to something that's easy to remember and then save the client. So now we've built a client that takes measurement protocol requests. So any measurement protocol looking request sent to this server container will now be claimed by this client. And this client will then create an event that I can use to fire my tags. And of course, I want to fire a universal. They just released a new version of GTM while we're talking. A universal analytics tag. So again, we have built-in tags here, and then we have custom built, which I've built myself up here. But we're going to use a universal analytics tag here. This tag is very bare. There's practically no settings here. And the reason for that is that it automatically uses whatever is in that measurement protocol request. So anything in that measurement protocol request sent from the browser will be automatically taken by this tag and sent forward to Google. So it's like a forwarder. You can override settings. You can set your own measurement ID. Let's say you want to send this to another endpoint. You can set it here. This is a great way to duplicate your Universal Analytics hits, by the way. you can just create new tags with different measurement IDs and have them fire for those events, and they will just send the same data to multiple endpoints. You can also override fields to set here. For example, if you wanted to anonymize the IP, you could set it here as well. But we're not going to do that. We're happy with the measurement protocol setup. For triggers, there's only a single trigger type called custom. There's no click triggers, no scroll triggers, because those are irrelevant. The server-side tagging, there's no click tracking there. There's no scroll tracking there. It's just digesting those incoming requests. But I want to specify that this tag should only fire when the Universal Analytics client causes it to fire. You can do a lot of cool things with these variables. For example, you can look at the request method or the request path. If the request path is, let's say, private, you can block this tag with it, for example. So you can look at the request. You can create variables for cookies in the request. You can create variables for request headers, such as do not track. You can add it as a variable here if you want to block the tag if the do not track header hasn't been set. But we'll just go with client name UA and save this one. And then we'll just save the tag as well. So just to recap, we've created a client that is waiting for measurement protocol requests. That client will create an event, and that event will fire fire our Universal Analytics tag, which takes this stuff in the measurement protocol request or that event and sends it forward to Google Analytics as a new measurement protocol request. And I know that this sounds really, really weird, but I'll show you in just a sec how it works. Because we still need to make a small change in the Google tag, in the web tag. In Universal Analytics, if I now used my web container, it would just send the data to Google Analytics. So we have to instruct this tag that instead of sending the information to Google servers, send it to my server-side endpoint. So I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a new field under More Settings, Advanced Configuration called Transport URL. And anything you type here, any URL you type here will be the new endpoint of this Google Analytics request. So now instead of sending the data to googleanalytics.com, the data will be sent to my server-side endpoint. And we're good to go. Let's refresh the web container. Let's reload the page. Let's hope there's not a demo effect. We can see that my Universal Analytics tag has fired. In real time, we can see my page view over here. And then in debug mode, we can see that there was an incoming request. And we can open the request tab and take a look at what that incoming request looks like. So this is what the web browser sent to my server-side endpoint. It's a measurement protocol request. These are all measurement protocol parameters, all of these ones that you know if you've ever used measurement protocol. And this request was claimed by a client. So the Universal Analytics client kind of raised its hand and said, hey, I want to take this request. It's a measurement protocol request. It's my request. So he took that request and he created an event out of that request. This is what the event model looks like. All of these parameters have been taken from the measurement protocol request, and they've been set as values of these generic names. And these are part of a so-called universal event schema. This is what Google wants you to use. This is what makes, this is what enables you to create those multi-purpose clients. You can have a Facebook tag and a Universal Analytics tag and an Atlas Web tag all firing with this request simply because they all share the same syntax and semantics for mapping these event fields to their own respective HTTP formats. So we have things like client ID, event name, we have the IP override, we have the user agent. Just a very quick detour, the IP override and the user agent are pretty cool things because they take the IP address and the user agent from the incoming request. So the user's browser's IP and the user's browser's user agent, and they map those. They send those to Google Analytics servers so that it looks like the request actually originated from the user's browser rather than the server container itself, because the server has its own IP address and its own user agent. And if you didn't have these overrides in place, those would be used instead. Which brings me to a very cool point about data, about privacy. One of the problems with IP addresses and user agents is that they are both fingerprintable surfaces. Basically, they are revealing potentially more about the user than you might want them to reveal. And IP addresses have been classified as personally identifiable information in many parts of the world. So one of the cool things you can do is, if you actually want to like fully anonymize the source of the request, you can actually set these, kind of unset these in the tag, in the server-side tag. And now, instead of using the browser's IP address and user agent, the App Engine servers, your server endpoint's IP address and user agent will be used instead. So in a very cool way, all the hits coming to Google Analytics will appear to come from a single IP address and a single user agent. It's a great way to completely hide the user and be compliant with a part of privacy legislation that has proven to be very difficult to enact with a purely client-side mechanism. So this lets you obfuscate that information. So anyway, just a bit of a detour there. This event fires then the page view tag that we created, and this tag itself has an outgoing HTTP request. So this tag itself creates the actual measurement protocol request to Google Analytics servers, and this is what it looks like. So this tag sent this HTTP request to googleanalytics.com. And now we've managed to transport Universal Analytics away from client-side communications to server-side. And now let's do the same with Atlas Web. It's almost the exact same process because they are so alike. So we create a new client for Atlas Web. We don't have to touch any of these settings. Let's just set this one again to JavaScript managed. Now we've created the Atlas Web client. This client differs from the Universal Analytics client in that it's expecting a measurement protocol version 2 request. So the measurement protocol request used by Atlas Web, it will not do anything when the Universal Analytics measurement protocol request comes in. It's not going to claim that because it doesn't care about it. It will only claim a request that looks like a measurement protocol v2. In tags, we'll create our new Atlas Web tag. Again, we can inherit all this stuff, measurement ID, event name. We'll just inherit them from the incoming request. And then we'll just trigger this when the client equals AW Atlas Web. So it's the exact same steps that I did for Universal Analytics. I created a client with the default settings. I created a tag with almost the basic default settings. And I added a trigger that fires when those corresponding clients do something. So in Web Container, you again have to make a small change. So the Atlas Web tag doesn't have that transport URL field you saw for Universal Analytics. Instead, you have to add a field, and the field name is transport URL in snake case, like so. So this is the same thing as what the Universal Analytics tag does. Let's preview, hit reload here. And now let's see if things went smoothly. We can see that the tag itself fired. We can see that now in preview mode, we have the measurement protocol request, but we also have a measurement protocol v2 request. So this is different. And it was claimed by the Atlas Web client, and it generated an outgoing HTTP request to Google Analytics servers. So we should be seeing it here, and so we do. So here's our page view from just now. So now we've managed to move Atlas Web to server side as well. So my site, I can just show you from the network logs. When I look at what's being sent to googleanalytics.com, there's just the analytics library download, nothing else. When I look at what's being sent to my endpoint, you can see the two measurement protocol requests. So the first one for the Universal Analytics and the second one for Atlas Web. So we have now shifted some of that third-party stuff to our server-side endpoint. But now I have two use cases to show you before we're wrapping this walkthrough up. Two very important use cases. So this is still fairly rudimentary. You're just replacing logic with server-side logic. It's still a great thing because you're reducing your content security policies, and you're removing those client-side communications with third-party vendors from the browser. But I want to show you one thing about consolidating those data streams, and then one about the cookies. So the first thing we'll do is let's try to get rid of the Universal Analytics web tag entirely, because it has such a similar logic to the Atlas web tag. Let's try piggybacking Universal Analytics on top of Atlas web, so reducing two streams into one. So let's start by deleting or pausing our Universal Analytics tag over here. And there, it's paused. It no longer fires on the site. And just to verify that it doesn't, let's reload the page. And now you can see that only the Atlas web tag fired. And nothing is, of course, collected into Universal Analytics real-time at this time. In server-side tagging, we can now also remove the Universal Analytics client because we won't be needing that anymore. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to have the Atlas web client still digest that Atlas web hit and fire the Atlas web trigger, but we'll also fire a Universal Analytics tag with that Atlas web trigger. So the Atlas web client takes that measurement protocol request and creates that generic event schema that I showed you, the one with the event names and client IDs. And all of those same parameters are used by the Universal Analytics tag as well. It can take those same key value pairs and map them into its own measurement protocol request because their semantics are so similar. The only thing you have to do is change the measurement ID, because by default, this would use the same measurement ID that Atlas Web has, so the G-something, and that's not a valid Universal Analytics property ID. So you need to add your Google Analytics property ID here. And we can actually just try the fields to set as well. Let's put a new field here just to show you how the overriding happens. And now let's save this. So the only thing I did was I switched the trigger so that both of these tags now fire on the Atlas web client. But other than that, I made no additional changes. So when I now hit preview, I can reload this page and I'll still see just the Atlas web tag firing. In debug mode, I'll see my Atlas web requests, but now I'll see two tags have fired, each with their own outgoing requests. So we have both the Atlas web request and the measurement protocol request. And then in Analytics real time, I can see my test page here. Har har, somebody found their way into my real-time metrics. Hello. But this test page was now generated by the Atlas web client. And in Atlas web, of course, we can still see our page view. So this is how I piggyback Universal Analytics using the single stream, and I don't have to kind of make any changes there. We can try what happens with events, because Atlas web uses the enhanced measurement, which generates these automatic events. So let's see what happens when I scroll to the bottom of the page. In debug mode, I'll soon see a scroll event. There we go, there's the scroll event. This was generated by the Atlas web client. And then in Universal Analytics, if I go to events, I can see that there's this general event category, which represents those enhanced measurement events with an event action of scroll. So scroll tracking, user engagement tracking, session start tracking is all automatically derived from the Atlas web stream. So this is one way to approach consolidation of those data streams. It's not perfect. You'll still have to figure out how to do custom dimensions, and it won't make sense in many cases, but this is the kind of thought process. Take two very similar data streams, fuse them into one, and then fan them out in the server container. That's the kind of thought process that leads to excellent results in the long term when it comes to things like client-side bloat and just making sure that no extra stuff is done in the browser. The other example I want to show you has to do with what Google's been doing with their cookies. So in the client, there's the new setting called cookies and client identification. We can move to a server managed client ID. So Google has now released a new version of the client identifier. Instead of using the Google Analytics JavaScript cookie, the _GA cookie that's been around for years, Google is now offering a way to move to an HTTP only cookie. So a cookie that is not accessible to JavaScript. And the cookie is named FPID by default. So when you save this client now and preview this container, you'll be able to see how a new cookie named FPID is set by the response back from the server container. It's an HTTP only cookie, as you can see here. This cookie, you can also see the cookie in the response itself. So if you go to the incoming HTTP request, you can see the response here. So the FPID cookie, it has this weird looking hash, and this hash is actually compiled of a number of different things, but one thing that is compiled of is the client ID from the GA cookie when you're using the kind of JavaScript migration option. So as long as the client ID stays the same, so 46836273 point something, this client ID is what's being sent to Google Analytics. So if you take a look at those outgoing requests, the client ID is over here, 46836273 and so on. As soon as I delete the GA cookie, or it expires because of Safari, like so, if I now reload the page, a new GA cookie is set with JavaScript, but what is actually sent to Google Analytics is now the hash in the FPID. So this is how the server-side environment migrates to the server-side cookie. As soon as the GA cookie expires, it will start using the FPID because a new user will be generated anyway. So it's just a cool way of showing how to move that logic away from JavaScript cookies, which are susceptible to intelligent tracking prevention and to cross-site tracking, and moving away to HTTP only cookies, which are so much more difficult to exploit for cross-site tracking, for example. So that was my walkthrough. I hope I've showed you enough. I know that these concepts can still be a bit overwhelming, but I'm going to be here for a while walking through them with you. So I'm just going to take a look at the Q&A at this point, and I guess that's where the rest of this conversation will happen. As soon as I reach the end, if I'm not completely spent, I can take a look at the chat as well, because I can see that there's been a lot of discussions there as well. So starting from the most upvoted question by Chris, what are the benefits to running server-side GTM on mobile apps where Firebase might be running? Is there a reason to do so versus tracking right out of the Firebase SDK? So the reasons are the same. Rather than sending data directly to Firebase, rather than downloading the SDK from Firebase, or well, you'll still have to do that, but rather than sending the data directly to Firebase Analytics, you'll be able to keep it in your staging area before you forward it to Firebase. However, I don't think that Firebase currently supports a server-to-server hit, and there's no, as far as I know, there's no way to add them to Firebase SDKs to change the location of where the data is being sent. I do believe that it's going to come up before this is published out of beta. I have no inside knowledge about this, but I do believe it will, because that's going to be a big question for many, how to deal with mobile. But mobile is the same as the web, so vendors will need to upgrade those SDKs and will need to make it possible to send that data to a server-side endpoint. Ricardo asks, you mentioned instead of data layer events, we now have HTTP requests. Where does the data layer stand with the server-side container? Won't be necessary anymore. So this is a question that came up in the previous webinars as well. It's very important to understand that this is not server-side tracking, it's server-side tagging. You still need something to send those requests to the server-side container with. I only use the data layer as an analogy. I wanted to show you that a web container uses the data layer, but server-side container uses requests. You still need something to send those requests to the server-side endpoint. And in this case, it could be the data layer in the web container. It could be inline JavaScript running on the page. It could be an image pixel somewhere. But whether or not you need a data layer depends on what you're doing in the browser. If you still want to send hits to a server endpoint using stuff in the data layer, then you're going to need the data layer. But it's just very important to distinguish those two from each other. So it's not server-side tagging that will replace client-side. It's not server-side tracking that will replace the need to actually track stuff in the client. It's just a server endpoint to which the client sends the data. Now I'm also painfully self-aware of using the word client in an ambiguous way. And this I completely blame Google for having this ambiguity in the first place. So there's a client, in this case, I'm referring to the browser or the device. And then there's the client in the server-side endpoint digesting that information. I'm not happy about that ambiguity. What about cookies that third-party tools like Facebook said? How is this going to happen with server-side tagging? Facebook uses first-party cookies these days. And their conversions API is fully compatible with server-side tagging. You can set first-party cookies with HTTP headers. You can read them from the HTTP headers. So tools like Facebook are fine. Tools that rely on third-party cookies, such as DoubleClick and any remarketing tools that use cross-site profiles, they're in trouble. Not just because server-side tagging doesn't support that, but also because their business model is severely compromised by web browsers tracking protections. So tools that rely on third-party cookies currently have no way to function in a server-side tagging environment because that's not a third-party endpoint. There is no access to those cookies that are written on third-party servers, and anything sent by the container to the third-party server would not have access to the third-party cookies set in the user's browser. So the question about what's going to happen to remarketing is not going to be solved by server-side tagging unless they use other means of cross-site profiling, such as fingerprinting or advanced matching with email addresses or something, assuming that they're going to be consent aware and respect the fact that they need opt-in consent, at least in the EU, for collecting that information. I'll wait until it's Q&A time to be replied, but I want to know how you plan to tackle the implementation of Facebook Ads Pixel. There's a convergence API, but it needs to be sent FBC, FBP, and EM values, which I believe cannot be set on the client since we're processing data on the backend. You can send the FB click ID from the browser to the server-side endpoint, and that will be used to match the user. You can send the user's email address from the browser to the server-side endpoint. That will be used to match the user. Facebook works perfectly with server-side tagging, and believe me, I've built the templates. I've tried it many times. So the Convergence API requires the FB CLID or the EM, the email, hash email. And those are set on the client because the client is the one that receives the click from Facebook. The client is the one where the user with the email address resides. So Facebook is fine. If I had 100 websites and 100 apps that all had similar structure, could I use one server container for each type? Sure. Yes. I'm not sure like what the alternative is. Having a single container that serves 100 different websites or something. As long as you have those domain names available, you can create as many server containers as you like, and just map them each to a new domain, subdomain. And obviously, you can create as many subdomains as you like. Maybe I didn't understand the question, so I'm sorry if I misunderstood it, but you could use as many server containers as you like. You could have a single server container catering to 100 websites and 100 apps, but that might lead to problems with scaling. I'm not sure how different horizontal and vertical scaling is in the Google Cloud. Maybe somebody else can reply that in the chat, for example. Fred asks, will heat map or session recording tags work server-side, or do they need client-side for this to work? Well, they're recording client-side sessions, and they're recording client-side heat maps, so they require a client-side component. The server-side tagging environment doesn't know where the user is moving their mouse. It's not running the browser. So they still need a client-side component. But I fully believe that Hotjar and tools like Crazy Egg and other similar tools will create new libraries, or at least will create the possibility to send that data to your server-side endpoint rather than directly to Hotjar or directly to Crazy Egg, and maybe even create like light versions of their JavaScript that could be proxied through the server-side endpoint instead. But yes, there is still a client-side component required. Jared asks, will there be a new tag type added to WebGTM for creating the HTTP request to the server-side endpoint, or will you always be required to generate the HTTP request in a custom HTML tag? This depends on the vendor, but yeah, there's going to be, so you don't have to use, this is another important part, you don't have to use a WebGTM to send data to server-side GTM. Anything that can send an HTTP request can send the data. It can be GTM, it can be on-page JavaScript, it can be an image tag, it can be, like I said, it can be a refrigerator, it can be your smart car, it can be your TV, it can be a command line tool. Anything that has the capability of HTTP communications can do that. So to create those HTTP requests to the server-side endpoint, you need something to build those. And if you're using GTM, then you need those custom templates to generate those. So, but some official templates like the Universal Analytics template already has a modification with the transport URL that you can use to redirect those requests. Ricardo asks, beam a bubble for the data. Does that mean I'd be able to clean a URL from PII, for example, before sending that to GA in this area? That's precisely one of the examples that I meant. So because you have full access to the incoming request before that is parsed into the event data, you could have a client which looks for those email addresses or other PII signals. Maybe there's even going to be a PII API. That sounds like a horror. Sorry, I'm too tired for that acronym right now. Personally identifiable information API that will kind of let you look for PII data in any string, for example, and will tell you whether that's PII or not, and maybe even redact it. That would actually be a really cool utility in server-side tagging. But you'll be able to clean that URL before you send it to Google Analytics, because you'll be able to map it to the correct event field without the PII in place. Max asks, can you talk about what this setup could look like without any client-side GTM container deployed at all? All the current documentation seems to show a web GTM container. Yes. So as I said, you don't need web GTM. I can talk about what it could look like. It could look like what the world was like before GTM, when we had JavaScript running on the page and on the site, or what tools like React do on a daily basis, which is bundle JavaScript and modularize analytics, or TypeScript. So analytics will just be its own, if it's sent from the browser, it will be its own little JavaScript library, something really lightweight, designed to send those as few streams as possible to the server-side endpoint. And I'm sure that these will be developed in unison with the popularity of the server-side tagging in GTM. If we use server-to-server integrations for server-side GTM, can we remove Google Tag Manager.com and other third-party endpoints from CSPs? And I think I talked about CSPs already, but yes, you can't remove GTM yet if you want to use GTM, because there's no way to proxy that from the server-side endpoint. But the more you remove those client libraries from the browser, the more you can remove them from the CSP as well. So that's definitely. Is the cost in addition to GA360 cost? I guess so. If you're running GA360, it doesn't really, it's not really related to server-side tagging. Server-side tagging has its own cloud cost. So the scaling cost for server-side tagging is what you pay for. I would find it weird to ever see server-side tagging behind a paywall. So having an enterprise version of it, I think it's a bit weird because it's not running on Google servers. It's running in your own environment. It's basically something you download from Google and then run in a containerized environment. So the costs associated will be the costs of running a cloud service, not a license cost to Google for running one of their services. But this is not inside information. Again, this is just me guessing what the situation might be like. Doesn't this require ad technologies such as Criteo, however you pronounce it, Google AdWords, Bing, Verizon, Facebook to also update their technology for the ID sync? If they want to survive, they have to make some moves. So yes, maybe. I'm not very sympathetic to ad tech that relies on cross-site tracking that happens without verified consent. But these tools would have to do something, not just because of server-side tagging, but also because third-party cookies are dying and are on their way out. So they have to adapt to this new environment and this new paradigm of first-party tracking and first-party analytics. We'll see what happens. They'll probably rely on fingerprinting and rely on clueless site owners passing user email addresses without proper consent in place. What was that advanced universal analytics tag type that you had available? It's just something I created myself. It's a very simple client tag combination that basically just sends the hit to GA, but it also rewrites the GA cookie as a set cookie header and the optimized cookie as a set cookie header to prevent them from being expired by Safari's intelligent tracking prevention. I've submitted it to the community template gallery, but we'll see if it ever ends up there. The template gallery for server-side hasn't yet been released because there's just not enough templates. So while we're waiting for that to be released, this is something that I did create. Please come to Brazil. Sure, I'll be there tomorrow. Oops. About the cookies, if you delete the one with the actual GA, the one from the server side gets used. Does that mean GA will understand that as a single user? No, it's going to be a different user, but it would have been a different user anyway because the user deleted the GA cookie. The difference is that Google Analytics now uses the server side cookie instead. If you delete the server side cookie, the FPID cookie, then the browser will start, then Google Analytics will use the GA cookie as well. That's just the migration option. I think at some point Google will want everybody to move to 100% server-side FPID cookie, simply because of the benefits it brings to things like mitigating against cross-site tracking. It doesn't make the cookie any more resilient to users deleting cookies. It will still be deleted if the user wants to delete it, but it's just a better way of storing data. The closer you can go to HTTP-only cookies, the closer you are to how cookies were originally designed to be used. Cookies are a very fragile technology, especially when set with JavaScript. Does client also handle sending data to a personalization tool, and how would that impact the timing of running a personalization tool such as page flicker? This is not really related to that at all because the page flicker is a client-side problem. So again, this is a server-side endpoint, a server-side tagging solution, and then you have client-side tools sending data to the server-side tagging environment. It doesn't fix Flickr, for example, because Flickr happens because the browser needs to download some JavaScript. Your server-side endpoint is unlikely to be as fast as the Google Analytics, Google optimized CDN. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to proxy optimize through your server-side endpoint. So this doesn't impact Flickr in any way, as far as I know, or as far as my imagination takes me, all things being equal. Will browsers always support the ability of a subdomain custom endpoint as first party, concerning that cookies are the only other thing that sounds remotely similar as far as data persistence is concerned? I don't have a crystal ball, but I will eat my hat 20 times over if subdomains are no longer considered first party. It's a staple part of how the modern web operates. There might be restrictions to how cookies are shared between first party domains, but even there, it's such a huge change. It would be such an enormous change to how the web works and how things like authentication and how things like SSO and shopping carts work, that I seriously, I don't think that's the thing that will be unraveled. What will be impacted is cookies' abilities to stay persistent. So their expiration is what's being hammered by all browsers at the moment, because that's an elegant way to solve that problem. The cookies aren't blocked and their functionality isn't restricted, but their expiration is. You mentioned better page performance and Lighthouse scores. What drives those improvements and how significant would they be? I have no idea how significant they would be, but what drives them is not communicating with third-party CDNs, with many different CDNs in a single threaded environment, not downloading heavy, complicated JavaScript libraries that need to be executed in the browser, and communicating with just being able to write your own cache headers into all the requests and responses. Those are the three things that came to my mind when I talk about site performance. It's not a silver bullet. It's just one way to improve marginally your page performance by reducing the communications with and downloading of third-party JavaScript. Can we manually deploy more than one server-side GTM container to the same Google Cloud project? Are there any implications of doing so? That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for you. I do not think that you can download. I do not think that you can create multiple server containers in the same project. I'm not entirely certain, but when you create a server container, I think that it creates the Google Cloud project for you there and then. So I don't think that you can add multiple containers. If there's a use case for that, I'm sure that Google will be happy to hear about it if you send feedback through the GTM UI. How can a single HTTP request to server side generate multiple hits to multiple vendors? Could you provide us with a walkthrough outlook? Well, I showed you Google Analytics and Atlas Web. The same logic can be applied to other endpoints as well. For example, the Facebook template that I've been building is almost ready to support that. It shares almost all the same fields that Atlas Web, because the hit is semantically very similar. It has an event name, it has key value pairs, it has custom parameters, but it does have some special things like the Facebook click ID and the login ID, event ID, subscription ID. So those just need to be tackled as well. How well will server-side tagging work with Roku? I don't have an answer for that, I'm sorry. Another question that can wait for the right time. Are there any complications with server-side tagging that are specific to sites using a CDN? I think almost all sites in the world use a CDN these days. I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean if the site is behind an entire, like Cloudflare or Fastly or something? I don't think there are any implications for server-side tagging. You just need to, I guess you could put the server-side endpoint behind the CDN as well, or behind the edge, but you don't have to. You can also exclude those routes to your server-side setup from passing through the CDN. So it would be a DNS-only setup, not a proxying setup. If you proxied them through the edge or through Cloudflare, for example, I'm not sure if there are any implications. It's just an additional step for those hits to pass before they reach the server endpoint. You can do some pretty cool things with the edge before the hit reaches the server-side container, I guess. I guess you could do some pre-staging already if you wanted to. If it's just a container, what's to stop someone from installing it on any other server? Literally nothing in this world is stopping someone from installing it on another server. Go ahead and do it. There are compatibility issues though. Debug mode won't work properly, and you might need to change some stuff in the Docker configuration, which hasn't been documented properly. Nothing's stopping. With recording of server to server online, I have seen the browser still records what is being sending to the server client at GCP. Is that the case? I have seen the browser still records what is sending. Well, if the browser is sending something somewhere, then obviously the browser will have a record of it. Is that what you meant? So if the browser is sending requests to the server container, they will obviously be visible in the browser in the network. Okay, great. Yes, so that is the case. If you sorry, if the browser is sending those hits, then they will be visible in the network logs. That's how the browser works. It has to have it shows all the network requests. My point about opacity and the opaqueness of data collection is that it's impossible to know from a single stream what happens in the server container. You don't know if that single stream will also be sent to Facebook and to Google and to Adform and to Hotjar and all these other vendors. You'll see just a single network request in the browser. What is the bottleneck of smaller instances? A small $5 server can handle hundreds of thousands of requests per month on DigitalOcean. I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't done extensive bottleneck testing. All I know is that a single App Engine standard instance can barely handle the weight of even a smaller site. It is a fairly elaborate setup running there. And again, if you find other service providers doing a better job, then that's how it is. And I'm sure that Google will optimize the flow and optimize the setups, and especially once this becomes portable to different cloud deployments, such as Cloud Run or other cloud vendors, then the situation will improve. It's still very early stages in the beta. This was released last week. But these are good questions. Don't take this as dismissive in any way. I genuinely don't have an answer. I haven't done the research of what is actually keeping that instance down. I haven't dug into under the hood enough. Is Google creating a debugging tool that lets you trace what vendors receive the single event stream? I'm not entirely sure what you mean with that. I mean, there is a debugging tool in the container itself, or do you mean a tool that can be used from the browser to show what happens in the server? Because that's impossible to create unless there's some extra information sent with all the HTTP requests. But even then, I don't see how that could be created. So there is nothing in the client that tells you what happens in the server. That's an important part of client to server communications. They are isolated instances. So unless the server decides to explicitly tell the client that, hey, by the way, your stream was just split into all these 5 different streams, there's not going to be any visibility to it. And Google will certainly not impose that kind of a response back to the client, because first of all, that's performance-wise, that's quite expensive. And also it might not be, there might be privacy issues there as well, or security issues. For example, if the data is being sent to some internal system for monitoring purposes, for legal reasons, it might be important that the browser has no knowledge that this happened. Just something I literally just now came up with, but yes. Yeah, so this is server side is a black box to the client. Anything the browser is aware of will need to be explicitly told by the server to the client. Is it possible to modify the received data in GCP with additional data or hash CRM data? Yes. This is absolutely possible. You can take any API available, communicate with that, and enhance the data. And this is a very typical enrichment process that lots of data pipelines do. For example, tools like Snowplow have this built into their core. And this is a risk. Like, this type of data enhancement, as cool as it is still potentially the server side, the organization acting as a data controller rather than just a processor. So you're kind of mixing your spoon into this mess of compliance, and that is a risk. And the browser is not aware of this type of data combinations and data combining going on and data brokering going on. So it just needs you to be very transparent about these in privacy policies and in how you communicate with your customers. But it is totally possible. And I think that from a technical point of view, it's one of the cool use cases for server-side tagging, because you could potentially just send, let's take Google Analytics as a very simple example. You could just send a transaction ID to the server-side endpoint, then have the server-side endpoint take the transaction ID and get all the transaction data from your CRM or your sales engine. So it doesn't have to exist in the client at all. And that way you can make sure that the transaction is sent to Google Analytics correctly and always in correct format. Any idea how the cost compares to Telium or Adobe? It sounds quite a bit cheaper. I have no idea. somebody else may be able to answer that for me. Is there any potential delay impact using server to server? Say if you're running real-time purchase propensity models with GCP, would this increase the lag or improve it if sending that data into GCP? That really depends on how much you put into this scalability. The latency is very low from my experience, but I haven't stress tested it. But I wouldn't trust a completely real-time lightning fast setup. I don't think that's the purpose, because this isn't a data collection mechanism, or it's not an analytics tool in itself that's supposed to do this type of real-time capabilities, even though you could use it for that. You know, one of the coolest things that I'm looking forward to are all the integrations that could be done in Google Cloud, such as a potential BigQuery API or a PubSub API. So being able to, for example, write directly to BigQuery or read something from BigQuery and instantly return a response is one of the really cool use cases for server-side tagging. But I'm not sure if even the 3 to 6 instances will be enough to reduce the latency enough. At that point, you might need to look at other deployment options. But I don't know, because I haven't thoroughly tested this kind of stuff. Those people who are leaving, have a great day. I'm just going to keep going. There's 16 questions left. We'll maybe have a couple more, and the recordings will be online, so you can go through the Q&A if you've missed that. But I'm going to stick around for a bit. Is there any correlation with marketing performance after implementation? That really depends on what you mean with correlation, what you mean with marketing, and what you mean with performance. So it's very difficult to answer that question in a general way. My own experiences with just analytics tracking is that obviously the tracking improves because of this side effect of circumventing those ad blockers. So, and Safari's cookie expiration problem is mitigated. So you'll have more users in your, fewer users in your analytics reports, for example. So that's the type of correlation. For the other types of correlations, you'll just have to build those data streams and look at them yourself. I'm sure there's going to be lots of case studies around server-side tagging to come that will tell you exactly how well it actually performs. If I'm not mistaken, the docs say that only a single client can acknowledge a request and no other client would be able to use the same. The use case we thought for this feature was more in the case of having a single request to the server-side container and activate numerous clients, such as having all the information on a single hit and mapping them to the respective tools. So it's technically possible right now, because a client can still parse the request without claiming it. As soon as a client claims the request, it's taken. No other client can anymore process it. But I have given feedback. I think that this is a bit confusing, and I hope that they'll restrict it so that certain APIs are only available once a request is claimed, such as running the container or parsing the response of the request. So your suggested scenario will likely not be possible. Instead, a single client always corresponds to a single stream. So a single stream can't initiate multiple clients, but the single client can fan it out to multiple tags. So that's the use case that you're looking for. Instead of creating clients, which are pretty complicated machines, all you need is a single client to create that generic event model, and then you can create your tags, and in those tags you can add additional logic that those respective tools and vendors actually require. Do we need to set up the measurement protocol first? I'm not entirely sure what that question means, but like I said, the server container digests requests. The requests need to be sent to the server container. So yes, you do need something that sends those measurement protocol requests to the container. I'm also aware that many of these questions were asked in early part of the presentation, so I might have answered them during the presentation. This is what happens when you don't have a moderator and when you're generally as unprofessional as I am. Is everybody able to create their own custom clients like the Facebook one Simo has? I only see 3 available. Everybody is able to create them if you know how. It's a sandbox JavaScript. There's a developer documentation online. I've written a guide about custom templates as well. It's not trivial. It's fairly complex piece of JavaScript, not because it's JavaScript, but because it's sandbox. So there's only certain APIs are available, but everybody can create their own clients. And I hope that as many people as possible do, so that we can populate them in the gallery for the benefit of others as well. Do you need a client per tag? Every single tag does need a client to perform, but you can have n number of tags firing with a single client. Given server-side tracking and now first-party cookies, should there be any changes in the content management tools of how GA cookie has to be classified? I don't think this has anything to do with how the GA cookie is classified in terms of GDPR purposes, for example. It is still a tracking identifier and should be treated as such. The fact that the technology changes from potentially from a JavaScript cookie to an HTTP cookie doesn't change that dynamic at all. Okay. What about server-side events? Can we send them to GTM now? Yes. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure what this question means. What is a server-side event? Do you mean an event that doesn't have a browser generating it? Yes, you can absolutely. You just need an incoming HTTP request sent from your CRM or your sales engine or your some web server. So again, the server container only cares about HTTP requests. It doesn't care where they came from, whether they came from a browser, another server, or from your, I've used refrigerator, car, and TV. What else? From your toaster. Like if you have a smart toaster, it can fire tags in server-side GTM because it's sending those HTTP requests. Oh, almost done. I'm feeling wistful. Can somebody add some questions there so that this will never end? Can you show how the custom Facebook client is written? Does it use the V2 measurement protocol data or some other communication? I can't show it, no. It is available in my GitHub, which I think I'll add to the video notes. I'm not going to show it now just because it takes so much time. But the Facebook client digests a custom feed from a new Facebook web tag that I created that doesn't load any Facebook JavaScript at all. It's a completely third-party-less stream of data. But I'm not sure if I'm ever going to publish it because I want to know what if Facebook is going to do something official with those templates first. But it is available in my GitHub already if somebody wants to take the manual steps of implementing it. Can a server-side client merge data from multiple events, say, for example, a measurement protocol 2 event combined with additional data from another custom event? That's a great question. Currently, no, because clients can't share information. But I hope that at some point there's going to be an API we can use that builds a temporary storage across clients, across requests, maybe even for the duration of the entire server container, which could let you kind of batch things together from multiple different requests and multiple different clients. So we'll see if that becomes possible. Currently, those events exist for the duration of the request itself. And once the request is over, that event data can't be accessed anymore. Joining late, will you be sharing this webinar on your YouTube channel? Yes, I will. Are you willing to show us your Facebook custom client and custom template solutions? I'm not going to show them here, but I'm going to add the link to my YouTube channel too. I'll just make a note if I haven't done it already. Yeah, I have it. Okay. So I'm just going to add the link to my GitHub. There's no instructions anywhere. You'll have to know how to import templates, and then you'll just have to kind of guess your way around. Because like I said, I'm not ready for to publish them anywhere yet. There's still a lot of work to be done. What is the biggest advantage of implementing server-side tagging? At this point, after this presentation, if that is still unclear to you, then I don't think there's anything else I can say about it. I've mentioned all the benefits in multiple times in this presentation, and there's quite a bit of blog posts online about it as well. Well, okay. The biggest advantages have to do with owning that staging area and reducing client-side bloat. Those are that. If I had to go to a desert island with 2 server-side tagging advantages, those would be it. You mentioned writing your own GA tag that rewrites the GA cookie via HTTP, but you also showed Google's take on this via the FPID cookie. What are the differences between Google's solution and your own? Very small, like the differences in terms of data collection in GA have nothing. There's no difference, basically. The FPID cookie does the same thing, which is have a bit more resilient cookie setup. The main difference is that I still use the GA cookie rather than create a new cookie entirely. But it's also not an HTTP only cookie; it's a JavaScript cookie. It's not. It's a non-HTTP only cookie, so it can still be accessed with JavaScript. In your opinion, so far, do you find it more scalable to create multiple clients, each purpose-built for a given request type and corresponding tags, or to create and manage a single? Okay, so or to create and manage a single client to parse information for multiple downstream tags? Again, an excellent question, and this gets to the heart of Google Tag Manager server side. This is the dichotomy that you have to kind of juggle with, whether to go for single stream or for multi-stream. There are use cases for both. From a data hygiene perspective, I would like to keep my analytics and my advertising and my marketing tags separate. I would like to keep those streams separate so that I can properly audit them and handle consent. From a performance perspective, I'd love to join them just so that I would have a single stream that's fanned out. So it's my opinion so far is leaning towards building separate clients, simply because currently that makes most sense. The vendors are not ready to work with the generic universal event schema, and I want to keep those streams separate. But once the vendors start building endpoints and tags that can digest a universal analytics event stream, for example, I will be tempted to combine those streams, indeed. But there's no hard and fast answer to this. I know that Google is very strongly going to be pushing for reducing the number of those streams and piggybacking off Atlas Web and piggybacking off Universal Analytics. I share their optimism, but I don't think that it's realistic for many companies at the moment. Could this be used as a webhook endpoint to relay to GA or another analytics solution? I guess so. Webhook is generally just an HTTP or a type of a REST API. So in that way, yes. I'm trying to figure out how a webhook would differ from a generic server-side API. If you can clarify the question a bit, like what you specifically mean with a webhook in this context, I can give a more educated answer. As you showed, you have to connect your domain to the server-to-server client, server-side client, if it's possible to add multiple domains to that. Yes, I think I mentioned this earlier, but you can add map multiple domains to your App Engine server, and it should work okay. Preview mode requires a single domain, so that will only work for a single domain, but you'll be able to send from multiple domains in first-party context to your server-side endpoint. If you consolidate multiple streams being sent to the server-side GTM, wouldn't it more often hit the URL length limit? Not necessarily, because the idea is that all those endpoints would use the same information that's encoded in the stream. So the same event name, the same parameters, the same client IDs, the same IP addresses would all be available to these other endpoints. So vendor-specific fields many vendors will start migrating them to a server-side friendly setup. So for example, with Facebook, currently the only field that I know of that is problematic is the event ID. So the event ID still needs to be set explicitly in the client, because that's used to deduplicate between hits sent directly to Facebook and sent through the Conversions API. So the event ID would need to be currently would need to be its own special field. Other than that, you could almost directly use an Atlas Web tag to piggyback a Facebook hit with. You still need to add things like Facebook client ID, but you can create a tag for that. You don't need a client for that. So you would need a tag to handle those cookies and so on. But yeah, consolidating multiple streams doesn't mean that the URL gets bigger. It just means that it will probably get a bit bigger, but it is not like a sum of its parts. You're reducing redundancy by having those overlapping parameters only once in that request. That's a good question, though. I know that this consolidation approach can be kind of difficult to get your head around. Can you give an example of a complex integration, like fetching data to augment the hit before sending it to vendors? Can I manipulate the incoming hit with JavaScript on the server before piping into the client? I think I mentioned a couple of examples. So you can, whatever APIs you can communicate with HTTP requests within the server, you can augment that data. I don't have any, well, let's take a geolocation API, for example. You could take the IP address from the incoming request, call the geolocation API, get the latitude and longitude back, and then add them to the hit. So you can kind of add geolocation information. So things like that, get the weather data based on that geolocation information. So call another API from the server-side container. That was the last question. Let me take a quick look if there's anything interesting going on in the chat. Okay, I'm not going to go through the chat. So much text. I'll go through it tomorrow when I've rested a bit. So thank you so much for having the endurance to spend 2 hours of your day with me. I hope I haven't persuaded anybody to change their mind if they are steadfastly against this as a concept. I just hope that I've given you enough tools to make a educated kind of approach to whether or not server-side tagging is good for you or not. I'm not preaching it as the be-all, end-all tagging tool. I think it's a tool, and as a tool, it's suitable for certain scenarios, and you need to figure out the business case for your organization by yourself. I know that there are going to be clients for whom I'm never going to be suggesting it to. However, I do think it's a very, very impressive piece of technology that once it has some improvements, for example, how it handles consent, and how it helps you consolidate those streams and validate those hits, I think it's going to be an extremely valuable tool in the tool case of people working with tagging. And it's going to be a huge benefit potentially to reduce that client-side bloat, improve the data and security and privacy, data security and privacy of the website and your apps, and just become this staging area for all the data passing through from your users to your MarTech and AdTech vendors. So like I promised, I'm going to delete the email list as soon as I leave this webinar, and follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn so you'll get the recording links that way. And other than that, just keep following the news. And if you have any questions, you can add them as comments to my blog posts, or just tweet them at me, or send me LinkedIn messages or something. But anyway, have a great day, everybody, and thanks so much for attending.